Right. I think I'll go ahead and get started with our introductory remarks so that I leave plenty of time for our panelists to give their presentation. So welcome to the California Offshore Wind Environmental Monitoring Framework webinar. This presentation is a production of the Pacific Offshore Wind Consortium, which we pronounce POWSI. You can go to the next slide, Ben. Next two slides, I would say. So POWSI is a university-led partnership. It is a consortium of 3 universities and centers within the universities. So the Schatz Energy Research Center at Cal Poly Humboldt. You can go ahead to the team members, thanks. And Oregon State University, where I am based, and the Pacific Marine Energy Center, and the Center for Coastal Marine Sciences at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, where Ben Ruttenberg, who is also one of our presenters today, is the director of the center. Next slide. So if this is your first POWSI webinar, welcome. Before we get started on today's presentation, I wanted to give you a short overview of some of the projects that we and our affiliates are engaged in to give you a sense of the breadth of research that the POWSI is involved in. We have recently released a draft report of an offshore wind transmission permitting analysis. We have underway a North Coast offshore wind transmission economic impacts analysis. We've recently completed some work looking at community perspectives about offshore wind at the national level, at the West Coast level, and specifically related to the Samoa Peninsula. If you're interested in that, we had a webinar over a year ago now introducing the project. Recently, we've done in-person sessions in Oregon, Washington, and the Samoa Peninsula earlier this month to share with the communities themselves the outputs of that project first, and we'll have a report coming out soon. Exciting new project that's currently underway is the ecological profile of the Humboldt wind energy area and transit route, including seabirds, marine mammals, salmonids, and other fish. That's a coast-funded project. Our most recent webinar that we had just last week, we had one on secondary entanglement and detection. And so if you're interested in that, you can go to the powsi.us website to access that webinar. We've also got an analysis of offshore wind transmission and storage. We've been conducting passive acoustic monitoring of the Humboldt wind energy area to listen for marine mammals. And then today's webinar, the environmental monitoring guidance that's been undertaken by the California Marine Sanctuary Foundation and Cal Poly SLO. As mentioned earlier, today's webinar is being recorded and it will be available online at the Schatz Energy Center or the POWSI website. Should go up in about a week. If you have technical difficulties, please use the chat box, as Maya just put in the chat. If you're interested in asking a question in our discussion following the presentation, please use the Q&A box for that. Without further ado, I will introduce our speakers. Dr. Rikki Eriksen is a senior scientist for the Program of Marine Spatial Planning for the California Marine Sanctuary Foundation. There, she works with communities, businesses, non-governmental organizations, foundations, academic institutions, and government agencies. She holds a master's degree from Duke University and a PhD from the University of Florida, where she applied landscape ecology principles to the design and management of marine protected areas. Dr. Eriksen's work as a lead scientist for this floating offshore wind monitoring framework builds off her long career conducting monitoring of marine ecosystems in coral reef, estuarine, kelp, and rocky reef ecosystems. She's also done a great deal of work in marine resource policy management, or development and management implementation using spatial ecological analysis, ecosystem-based management, as well as education and outreach. Dr. Ben Ruttenberg, who is one of our POWSI core team members, is a professor of biological science and director of the Center for Coastal Marine Sciences at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. There, he works with a variety of partners to develop new research questions, measure and track the effectiveness of operations of the center, and help seek funding for all the research initiatives there. Ben's master's degree is from Yale, and he has a PhD in marine ecology from UC Santa Barbara. Ben has investigated basic, ecological, and applied research questions. His early work focused on reef systems and reef fishes, and his current work is primarily focused on fisheries and topics related to the blue economy, including over 10 years working on questions related to offshore wind. So thank you, Ben and Rikki, for spending this time with us today, and take it away.
Super. Thank you so much, Maya and Sarah. And it is a pleasure to be able to be here with you today. Like Sarah said, I am Rikki Eriksen, and I am here on behalf of an incredible team of many people. I'm recognizing here many of the co-authors on this from the Cal Poly SLO floating offshore wind team, Ben and Zoe, as well as Eliza Thomas, and the team from the California Marine Sanctuary Foundation, myself, Hadley Clark, and Ella Merkel. And this was conducted in collaboration with the Ocean Protection Council, as well as the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. And we had the pleasure of working with over 270 scientists across the state and nation to help put this together. So if we go to the next slide, Ben. So we're going to look a little bit backwards if we talk about California's offshore wind plans as of 2025. You're looking at a map on the left there of the state of California and off the coast of Eureka, as well as off the coast of Morro Bay. These are anywhere from 28 to 30 nautical miles off the coast of California. We have multiple 5 wind lease areas. Those are shown in the box on the right-hand side. And these areas are now potentially changing, but this was our purview, was to create a floating offshore wind monitoring guidance for the entire state of California, with using these offshore wind lease areas as kind of the conceptual framework for where we are talking about. If we go to the next slide. So this floating offshore wind in California is very unique in the sense that it has never been done this far offshore and in this deep of waters anywhere in the world before. So when we're talking about, and we have the California Current Large Marine Ecosystem, which is one of the most productive and dynamic ecosystems in the world. And so placing floating offshore wind infrastructure all the way out. If you look to the left of this graphic here, you're seeing where we are considering in terms of floating offshore wind effects is anywhere beyond the floating platforms where impacts might occur, all the way to the high tide watermark, to where inside the estuaries and up to the high mean tide watermark in California. And so when we're talking about floating offshore wind infrastructure, I just want to walk you through the different components. So if you look at the left side of this graphic, you are seeing the rotors, which are extremely large, and those are attached to this shaft that goes down to these floating offshore wind platforms below. So each one is a platform, and there will be roughly, we don't really know how many yet, but at least 200 of these per floating offshore wind lease area. And these platforms then are moored to the bottom with mooring lines, just like you do on a sailboat. And there are likely going to be about 3 of those. And then from these platforms, you see these midwater cables that are going from the platform to a substation or a transmission station. So each one of these platforms will have these midwater or floating cables that are actually moving the energy towards shore. And then once they get to these transfer stations, which are closer to shore, then we are also looking at the impact of those transmission cables, which are likely going to be buried or placed on the benthos depending on what the environment are. And then you see that that red line moves all the way to the terrestrial land-based grid. And so in our thinking of the environmental impacts of floating offshore wind, and we use the terminology infrastructure, we are talking about all of these different pieces of the infrastructure. Now, obviously, when we get into specifics, we talk about, are we talking about the blade? Are we talking about the cable? But the term infrastructure refers, generally to all of this new equipment that will be in the water. So if we go to the next slide. So just a little bit about what this document is and what this document isn't. So it is called the California Offshore Wind Environmental Monitoring Framework. It is not a regulatory document. We have permitting information in here, but it is not conceived as a regulatory document. It is also not a recipe book for monitoring programs. And it is not a specific place-based document. The only place we talk about specifically is actually Humboldt Bay because it is so unique and there is an offshore wind lease area out there. But we as the team, as well as the scientists, we all are anticipating that a next phase of this would be monitoring plans for specific places. So this is not in lieu of this. This is at a higher level, overarching scientific guidelines and principles and recommendations of how to guide these next step priorities for the state. What it is a source of scientific information to begin to understand the potential offshore wind effects or impacts in California. And I'm going to go into a little bit more detail, but some of the framework outputs are, what are the key questions that the state should be interested in asking and we as scientists are concerned about? And then we have overarching recommendations that guide the state on where to start, how to get set up, how to use this pause in offshore wind implementation in California effectively and efficiently. And then we actually dive into question-specific recommendations for priority species, priority habitats, and priority ecological processes, such as upwelling, right? You could imagine that's something we're all concerned about. So if we go to the next slide. So how did we collect this information? This was, obviously a giant group of tent of scientists. And what we did is we divided these groups of scientists. We invited individuals specifically with particular areas of expertise to participate in these expert scientific working groups. And we had a group on habitats and ecosystems, oceanography, marine mammals and sea turtles, seabirds and bats, fish and invertebrates, as well as data and technology. And we also subdivided these expert scientific working groups into subgroups. So you might anticipate with marine mammals and sea turtles, there are questions specific to haul out of harbor seals, that is very different from looking at entanglement for beaked whales. And so we further drilled down into those levels of expertise. And so these 5 in blue are the expert scientific working groups. And then we had this cross-cutting group for data and technology. And invitations were sent out to scientists to participate, as well as a formal request for tribal scientists to engage and participate in these scientific working groups. This was all conducted, this outreach, at the beginning of the project. And however, I just want to be clear that meaningful tribal engagement was not achieved as part of this project and will be gathered at a later date. So we had these 5 expert working groups plus this cross-cutting data integration and technology working group. who all had expertise, and we had a series of many working group meetings over the course of the last year and a half. So if we go to the next slide, Ben. So what did we do? We were starting with, we're working in a new application of offshore wind in an environment it's never been tested before. The technology is not tested. So where we started is this team actually conducted a very in-depth literature review of the scientific information that was relevant or is relevant to our taxa, our habitats, our dynamic ecosystem, as well as the environment in which we are placing it in. And so we did this literature review, which is a product that we can easily share with you. And then we relied heavily on these ecological and data integration and data technology ecological working groups to define what the impact matrices were. And then we used this expert opinion elicitation process, which is just a semi-quantitative way of collecting information from scientists in a structured format on the anticipated intensity of a potential impact, the frequency, the amount of confidence that scientists had in that, to begin to narrow down on what we really thought were the concerns that we should all be focused on. We also worked with a number of decision trees and decision frameworks to identify and narrow down what are the priority monitoring questions that we should be really focused on. Things like, is a question answerable, was actually a criteria in there. We also used a decision tree to look at what are the priority taxa. That might be taxa that are endangered or of recreational and commercial concern. And then we also looked at priority and identified what the priority relevant habitats are. So all of these things are outputs of this environmental monitoring framework, again, across the whole state of California. And then from that, we came up with these specific, very different levels or tiers of monitoring recommendations. And then the data and technology group was working across all of this, intimately involved in all of the information gathering and helping to direct the expert working groups to get to the types of recommendations that we thought were going to be most useful for the state. So this is the scientific approach that was used in absence of actual data out there that has been collected because it's not available. If we go to the next slide. So this is a monster document. This is a document that is about over 350 pages long. And I thought what would be most useful for you is to understand what are the different pieces of the document, because I think our team realizes that maybe somebody's not going to read this entire document, but I think that specific outputs and appendices of this document are going to be used by different groups for different purposes. And hopefully we've synthesized and served up this information in a way that can have a lot of future applications. So there is a large, robust section on data and technology that you will find in the framework. They come up with standards and recommendations. There is an appendices of an analysis of the sensors. That's the piece of equipment that actually collects the data. And there are many different data types. But this analysis of sensors that can be used with kind of the pros and cons and trade-offs between the sensors. There is an analysis of the platform. So think of a platform as a vessel or an ROV that you then affix actual sensors to. So there's also that appendices that goes through the pros and cons of the different platforms. And then we have a general limitations and opportunities appendix for all of the different information collecting sensors. So that's one whole section of the document. You can see that Maya dropped it in your chat. So the framework findings and working group sections. So remember I talked about the decision trees to come up with priorities, priority questions, priority taxa, priority habitats. We have the results from those different priority binnings so that you can see what information was utilized to actually assign prioritization. We have the monitoring questions that we considered, as well as the priority monitoring questions, the species prioritization, the foundational recommendations. These are overarching recommendations like start with understanding what we already have in our wheelhouse in terms of information, and then these very robust impact specific recommendations tables. And then I'll just point out two additional appendices that may be of importance to you are we have this permitting table that identifies for each of the state agencies what are the permitting requirements associated with a permit so that we can look at the whole document is sort of linked by data type. That is a standard that we utilize throughout the document so that you can cross-cut and see like, oh, this state lands commission, requests this. And so we see a lot of future purposes for this information, as well as another appendices is we synthesized and created a table of all of the California ocean and taxa, species specific and habitat specific monitoring programs. So these are all of the outputs. I'll leave it for you. It's got color-coded document. It is not completely formatted because this is still a draft document. But please have a look at that, and we are always here to answer questions. If we go to the next slide, Ben. So this is just to give you an idea of what the expert elicitation or stoplight analysis looks like. It's called a stoplight because it uses red, yellow, green. And this is just to show you an example of how we use the stoplight to analyze the impact of noise on injury or mortality of nearshore marine mammals. And so you can see here that we've divided up the impacts into the different phases of operation. So you're looking at spatial avoidance. Does an organism move away from the offshore wind field during construction or operation and maintenance? And we look at what do we think the intensity of that impact would be on spatial avoidance. Is it a positive or negative? What's the spatial scale? Is it impacting them on a, meters scale or kilometers wide? What is the temporal scale? Here we see that for both of them, it is long. The likelihood of something happening, and then do we know how to mitigate against this? So do we have an understanding from other offshore wind monitoring programs and implementation of developed wind fields to how can we actually address this? And so this is just to give you an example of how we use this tool to collect expert opinion. If we go to the next slide. So this is just some of the potential general effects that the scientific working group experts honed in on. So concerns about infrastructure, again, all of the different pieces of infrastructure and vessel traffic. So there is concern about direct impact or entanglement with the offshore wind infrastructure. That's typically thinking about either birds that are getting struck by the rotors or marine mammals and other organisms that get entangled in equipment or gear that might be drifting off of the floating offshore wind farm. Physical emissions. So we're concerned about sound and noise, and to a lesser extent, electromagnetic fields. That's the energy that will be transmitted through the cables that are transmitting the energy. to the grid. That's how we get the power. There's concerns about ecosystem dynamics. So there will clearly be habitat modifications. Think of modifications inside the estuary with dredging, and infrastructure development. Think of placing an offshore wind farm offshore in an area that is typically a migratory route, but now you have, several hundred wind platforms out there that might actually attract fish and invertebrates to that. So concerns about cascading predatory prey relationships or behavioral modifications in highly migratory species. And then finally, environmental changes. The big concern is changes in oceanography, whether it's physical or biological or chemical, or the release of pollutants either from dredging and filling or the discharge of pollutants from the offshore wind infrastructure itself. So these are some of the things that we had in our mind as we're going through this. If we go to the next slide. So some of the overarching recommendations as a first starting point. So this is what the scientist thinks is where we start to prepare us better for in-water or above water monitoring. So there was a strong agreement that synthesizing, analyzing, and leveraging the existing information that we have from all the great monitoring that has been conducted in California should be our first step, so that when we do go to in-water monitoring, we know that we're doing it in the right places, asking the right questions, and leveraging the wealth of investment that we already have in California. Secondly, in this column is the integration. So in many cases, we have great information on where the whales are or where the birds are, but we have not incorporated or analyzed that information in combination with the physical and biological underlying drivers of that. So we want to make sure that we look at weather and oceanographic conditions so that we can understand why are animals where they are, what are they doing, and can we predict based on these environmental conditions or parameters where they might be in the future? Because we're all concerned about climate change muddying up the signal, basically, of us being able to detect what offshore wind impacts might be. So secondly, this middle column is gap filling. There was large agreement that we need to leverage the existing programs, either the cow coffees, the ooses, the access, the rockfish surveys that NOAA does, and leverage those programs and affix new sensors to those programs to fill gaps that we identify in this first identifying the gaps in the data synthesis column, and then collect priority taxa and distribution data and measure the oceanographic processes using both conventional and new technology. So big statement was that don't drop the old. Everybody's excited about things like eDNA, and that's going to be revolutionary, but we should continue to use both a combination of our conventional and emerging technologies. And we should start exploring, fixing existing platforms and new platforms that the offshore wind industry is going to put out there with these new technologies. So there's an opportunity now to do multi-taxa, multi-parameter monitoring at the same sites. And that was a real overarching recommendation. So if we go to the next slide. Ben. There we go. So our next recommendations were surrounding kind of getting the state set up for, adaptive management and understanding cumulative impacts. And so the thought was some recommendations from the scientists came out that defining the thresholds, how many whales, how many birds are too many at a population level, we were concerned about population level consequences of offshore wind on these species, on these habitats, and that we should define what these things are before we have offshore wind development. Also, a recommendation to develop maps of ocean spaces and uses, including things like anthropogenic and socioeconomic and other ecological habitats. And then also doing this kind of cumulative system level effects where we identify what the existing stressors are so we can begin to tease out what the specific offshore wind impacts are versus climate variability, natural variability, and then these cumulative stressors. So a lot of interesting work ahead. Next slide.
Thanks. Thanks, Rikki. I think this is me now.
Okay. Super.
Yeah. Thank you, Rikki. And again, I want to give a shout out. First, a thanks to Sarah, Maya, and the whole rest of the team at the POWC for putting this on. And to Rikki and the team at CMSF for leading this huge and heroic effort. This was an enormous task with I don't know if you mentioned, Rikki, but it was somewhere in the neighborhood of 250 scientists were involved in this, plus lots of other folks. So it has been no small task, and I just want to make sure that everyone on this call knows just how much work CMSF did to pull this off. All right, so I want to start talking a little bit about some of the more specific effects here. So we're going to start with the effects of habitats, ecosystems, and oceanography, and some of our kind of overarching recommendations. So things for us to consider and think about. And again, we talk about these as impacts, but really we want to think about them as effects, because in some cases, the impacts are going to be difficult to measure given the high variability in those. So we know that there are going to be some effects from this infrastructure during construction. And we know there's going to be some effects from the infrastructure during operations. And again, as Rikki mentioned, this has never been done in waters this deep. And so, trying to get a handle on what some of those effects are going to be is going to be very, very important. We know there are going to be effects from port development. Most likely, if this all goes forward, those effects are going to be strongest in Humboldt than likely than anywhere else. And so really trying to consider what those impacts are going to be from the specific port development. And again, as Rikki mentioned, we know that Humboldt Bay is going to be a special case. And we did not have the scope to address Humboldt Bay specifically. We know that there's going to need to be a separate process to really think about what's happening up at Humboldt. We know there's going to be some impacts on physical oceanography. There may be some changes to upwelling and then the nutrients, and then cascading forward, there are going to be some effects on the biological oceanography as well. But the key thing to keep in mind, especially with those impacts on the oceanographic scale, is that the California current large marine ecosystem is incredibly dynamic and incredibly variable. And so it may be a challenge to tease out what natural variability or variability from changing climate are relative to the effects from port development. There seems to be a delay with the slides appearing. So hopefully you are all seeing that second overarching recommendation slide for habitats, ecosystems, and oceanographies. But the strategic priorities here, again, as Rikki mentioned, we certainly need to maintain the extensive long-term monitoring programs that exist in California. We need to enhance some of the capabilities of those, as Rikki mentioned, things like fixing additional sensors or maybe filling in some of the gaps. And then to the extent that there is new work needed, try to establish the new programs, whatever those are. Again, there's going to need to be a great deal of work to determine what those gaps are. There's likely going to be a great deal of mapping, geotechnical and geophysical surveys that are going to need to be done. And so finding ways to coordinate those activities so that they are happening concurrently along, ideally in concert with monitoring, to try to understand first what we're learning from those surveys, and second, if there are any effects for us to be able to detect them. And an upwelling is likely going to be a key issue. Some of the modeling work from Integral and others have suggested that there may be some changes due to upwelling, but again, given the variability of the system, are those changes going to be detectable and then result in detectable changes in the biology? That is something that is still very much unclear. Marine mammals and sea turtles. I love this icon of a whale tail and a swimming sea turtle above it. Some of the main things that we need to be thinking about are monitoring for the acoustic impacts. We know many of these organisms are going to be very sensitive to changes in the soundscapes in these environments, both from construction and operations. And so being able to detect those changes, see if we can detect behavioral changes that result from them, with the, I think, fairly significant caveat that offshore wind development on the West Coast and in California is going to be in much deeper water. It's not going to include pile driving, which is the main acoustic impact that we have seen in other places where offshore wind has been implemented. Clearly, there's going to be some increase in vessel traffic, which is going to increase vessel strike risk to some degree, and so trying to understand what the increases in that vessel traffic are going to be, and then what those changes are, and being able to monitor and detect them. We know that this infrastructure and vessel presence has the potential to have an effect on where and how these organisms are using seascapes, and so being able to monitor for those and also do some predictive modeling to try to predict how those changes might be manifest and whether those ultimately lead to population level impacts is going to be important. Entanglement risk has been raised as a concern, and so really trying to understand, is this happening? Is this something that does have the potential to impact populations? There's been a great deal of work trying to develop new technologies to detect things like secondary and tertiary entanglement. That is when lost fishing gear gets hung up on existing infrastructure, and then a marine mammal swims through that. That's called secondary entanglement. Tertiary entanglement then is when an organism is already entangled, swims through some sort of hard infrastructure and gets hung up. These have been raised as concerns, and the question is still unknown how much of an effect this is going to be. But some of the work that the folks at Humboldt and their partners have done, or excuse me, Cal Poly Humboldt and their partners have done, is look to see, are there technologies that we can put on cables and infrastructure to detect changes in vibration that indicate that something is attached, whether it's a piece of lost fishing gear, or worst case, a piece of lost fishing gear with some animal stuck to it, entangled within it. And then, of course, there are also going to be some non-acoustic environmental effects, and so really developing that monitoring or marshaling that monitoring that we have to evaluate that as well. Again, strategic priorities for marine mammals and sea turtles, as Rikki mentioned, really trying to coordinate and integrate these tools as much as possible, adding as much monitoring technology to every single platform and every single vessel and every single trip that is out there as possible to get as much information as we can. That's acoustic, visual, tagging, oceanography, and then of course modeling. Really trying to develop an understanding of where the high use habitats are, where those migration corridors are, where the areas that they are potentially feeding, and focus monitoring in and around those areas, knowing full well that many of these animals that are foraging in offshore spaces are simply following the food, which follows the oceanography, which we know is very, very dynamic. And then, of course, finally, just some more fundamental ecology back in spaces where I'm more comfortable, thinking about the abundance and distribution of these animals, their changes in life history, and their movement. And again, much of that is likely going to be tracking changes in oceanography. Birds and bats, one of the main concerns is collision risk. That is, that these organisms swimming into and through some of these offshore wind farms, colliding with the turbines themselves. Although there has been some really encouraging work from both the East Coast and Europe, suggesting that many species, at least in those spaces, seem to be pretty adept at avoiding the wind farms, or even even flying directly through them. But understanding what their spatial distributions are, and how they are responding to this, again, the work that we've seen elsewhere, those are different species than that we see here in California and on the West Coast. And so, are the species here going to be responding similarly, or are they going to be responding differently? And then, of course, these organisms in many cases are foraging offshore because that's where their food is going to be. And so, trying to understand how their food sources and the things that they are targeting are moving, potentially due to natural variability, climate-driven impacts, and trying to disentangle those from the effects of the wind farms themselves. And then, of course, tracking migration routes is going to be critically important. And so again, the similar sorts of recommendations and for birds and bats, really integrating the monitoring that we have to understand how these animals are using this ocean space. How is their flight behavior changing as a result of deployment of wind farms? Can we predict where they're going to be as the climate changes? Again, those are the environmental drivers, the changes in oceanography that are going to be likely changing the areas where they're going to be foraging. Developing new technologies for risk detection, things like radar systems and acoustic systems. Many of that work is already in the process of being developed, and so understanding those and being able to deploy those effectively is going to be really, really important. If we know that there are high risk habitats, such as clear areas where there are migration corridors that are used over and over again. Understanding where those are going to be, especially near shore and in the wind energy areas themselves, and deploy extra monitoring in those areas is going to be important. And then, of course, prioritizing our high risk species, those that are potentially threatened or endangered, and those species for which we have really limited data to be able to understand them better. So fish and invertebrates, again, likely going to be certainly going to be some effects of habitat alteration. As Rikki mentioned, when we put a bunch of physical structure in spaces that has been open ocean and soft bottom, and put anchors and things down there, that is certainly going to have some changes to those habitats. Are there changes that we can detect from the benthic pelagic coupling, or bottom up or top down sorts of effects? There may be some changes in the physical oceanography that's then going to drive some of the biogeochemistry, particularly related to upwelling and nutrient availability. There are likely going to be some changes due to behavioral ecology. We know that for fish especially, and also really inverts, if you put hard bottom structures out in the ocean, invertebrates will settle on them, fish will swim to them. And so how is that going to ultimately end up changing the behaviors of individual species, which is going to cascade up to population level impacts? And then how might that impact connectivity amongst these different places? And then finally, what are the net impacts of all of these changes, resulting in population dynamics of these populations, especially populations that we care about. So strategic priorities again for fish and invertebrates. As Rikki mentioned, we want to continue doing a lot of the work that we have been doing, sort of the survey work that has been ongoing for a long time, but augment those with some new tools. eDNA shows enormous promise. There's still a lot of work to do to ground truth what it's telling us, but being able to collect those sorts of data on a more regular basis is certainly going to be able to potentially shed a lot of light on things that are changing. the use of new acoustic technologies to detect changes in abundance and size structure of key species, and of course, AUVs and other automated technologies are going to be really important. This is really true for everything, but especially for fishes. Understanding species distribution models, particularly as we're adding really truly novel habitat into these spaces that have never had structures like this. How might that influence both attraction of some species, displacement of others? Does it lead to net productivity or simply net attraction? Trying to understand those is going to be very, very important. And in many cases, we're going to need models to try to predict how some of that would work. And then, of course, increasing our oceanographic monitoring obviously is going to be really important. Again, because of the long-running monitoring programs that have existed in this system, we know an enormous amount about the oceanography. But again, trying to do some of that modeling to predict how some of these oceanographic processes might be changed with hard structures, particularly things like changes in nutrients, changes in plankton, changes in larval dispersal, and then this question of attraction and displacement due to these novel structures being implemented in these places. Data integration, it was this cross-cutting idea, thinking about how we think about data and technology across all of these different spaces. The first set of recommendations really are the core principles of data science. Data need to be transparent and they need to be accessible. That is, we need to be able to see them and we need to be able to use them. They need to be well documented, and the studies need to be repeatable. That is, they need to have excellent metadata to understand, so that people can understand what was done. The methods need to be clear and transparent so that work can be repeated. They need to be collected and stored in some sort of standardized way so that they can be used and reused in multiple different ways. We hear over and over again about, as soon as large data sets are made available, there are novel questions that we can answer that didn't occur to us at the time of collection. And so making sure that these data are available for use in the ways that we think that they should be used, and also in ways that haven't occurred to us right now, but that can still help us answer many of these questions is going to be important. They need to be ethical and needs to protect privacy when that's appropriate. They need to be networked. They need to be interoperable, and then these data need to be fit for purpose, right? They need to be collected in a way that can actually address the questions that need to be addressed. So some of the recommendations that resulted from the data group is a publicly available catalog of all the data that could potentially be collected as part of this or used for this. Ideally, having pooled data, things like data lakes that could potentially be used to train AI models. We know that AI is going to be critical for all of these going forward, just because the volume of data is going to be so tremendous, and AI has enormous potential to help us answer questions in ways that we couldn't before. And we're going to need to throw a lot of training data at these models to make sure that they're telling us what we think that they're telling us. Obviously, we can't emphasize data accessibility enough, making sure that data are available and discoverable. When data are published, they need to be published with metadata so that folks in the future can, who are not part of the study, can find things, understand what was done, and figure out how to use them effectively. Ideally, we want to really encourage the use of open source software with appropriate cybersecurity protocols. The open source obviously means that then, if someone wants to repurpose code or repurpose an analysis, they don't have to spend potentially many thousands or tens of thousands of dollars to buy access to proprietary software. And then one key thing that I think is really important, that is a problem that has arisen over and over again, is at the end of a project, often folks have gone out and collected an enormous amount of really, really valuable data, and sort of running up to the end of the project, and they run out of funds, and there hasn't been sufficient thought in how to maintain the lifespan, the life cycle of those data. And so setting aside some small percentage of budgets, 5 to 10%, to establish appropriate infrastructure to make these data available over the entire lifespan of projects, we think is really, really important. Again, some additional technology recommendations. Comparing methods and identify effective sensors. There are lots of recommendations here, but clearly some of this is going to need to be ground truthed. And we expect sensors that are going to be developed, in the next couple of years that don't exist right now. And so trying to understand what their pros and cons are and how effective they are. We really want to suggest doing a great deal of data integration and predictive modeling. To try to understand where the gaps are going to be, where the key areas are going to be, before we start installing new things, new sensors or implementing new programs. As I mentioned, AI and eDNA are going to be critical new technologies, and so finding ways to advance those in ways that are really effective. Using multi-sensor platforms and multimodal monitoring, as we've talked about several times, is going to be very, very important. Anytime that there is something deployed out in the ocean, we really need to outfit it with absolutely as many sensors as we possibly can that allow us to scale across a whole range of different taxa. Certain technologies may be appropriate for some taxa and not others, and so trying to outfit an instrument or a device or a platform or an AUV or a vessel or whatever that is to be able to collect all of that's going to be really important. And then as offshore wind infrastructure is deployed, we would love to see every single one of these things that is deployed absolutely bristling with as many instruments as we can put out there. Will allow us to collect an enormous amount of information, both about what's happening in and around these wind farms and also about the oceans in general to a scale and a degree that we've never had the opportunity to do before. And so a couple of other things as we talk about the effects. There's been some of the effects that we've mentioned. There is a great deal of concern about, but we want to emphasize that the things that we've talked about are potential effects or potential impacts, and truly we don't actually know how severe many of them are going to be. But we do know that population level impacts are likely going to require a series of multiple cumulative and unlikely events. This is a diagram sort of repurposed from Andrew Copping's work, thinking about tidal turbines, but the process is essentially the same. That we have, what are the probabilities that animals are in the water near the structures, they're at the appropriate depth or at the appropriate height to have an impact. They're in that space when things are moving quickly, where there could be some impact, where the animals are not avoiding them. They actually have an impact, and that impact actually then results in some injury or mortality to that individual animal. And again, each of these events has to occur in concert sequentially, and each of them is likely some relatively low probability. A couple of other things about effects as well. Some of these detects may be small and they may be negligible, and many of them are likely going to be undetectable due to the incredible variability in this ecosystem that is inherent in this system, as well as the new variability and changes that we're introducing via climate change and global warming. We also want to emphasize that offshore wind, the whole reason that we're having these conversations is because of the climate crisis. We know we need to decarbonize our economy. We know that warming oceans continue to have severe and substantial impacts to marine ecosystems, and these are likely to grow. We all know that a big El Nino is coming. And as a scientist, I will say I will be interested to see what effects it has. And as someone who cares about the ocean, I'm going to be really horrified to see what effects that this growing El Nino has. We know that events like these marine heat waves are likely to become more frequent and more intense as a result of all of our use of fossil fuels. And so figuring out ways to decarbonize is really important to this. And again, I just want to emphasize this point that we've talked about several times about the difference between effects and impacts. There are likely to be effects. There may be some impacts, but they are not the same. Effects implies some very strong negative change that we are clearly able to detect, and we think in many systems they're going to be very, very difficult for us to detect these changes. A couple of other, a couple of other sort of specific issues. Electromagnetic fields has been raised as a potential effect, but it's important to note that these electromagnetic fields often extend only meters into marine systems. And so while they may have organisms may be able to detect them and respond to them, those changes are going to be over likely very, very small spatial scales. Marine mammals, as I mentioned, that these concern about secondary and tertiary entanglement have been raised. And as far as we know, there are no examples of this occurring. There may be some, but we have not been able to find them. And again, what we're talking about is a scale that is larger than anything that's been deployed. But we don't know how severe of an effect this is actually going to be. With birds and bats, we know from a great deal of work in conservation that focusing where the primary effects are is certainly going to be much more, let's say, impactful from a conservation standpoint. So for bats, thinking about, we know many of the things that are impacting bat populations on land. So focusing there is important. And we know that for many birds, being able to improve conditions at their breeding sites by doing things like removing invasive rats and things like that can have huge and very strong positive effects on their populations, and potentially far more than what we might be able to do offshore. Again, so important to keep those things in mind. And then there may be some positive effects, again, as we think about some of these things. Wind energy areas are likely to serve as de facto marine protected areas. They may or may not be completely closed to fishing, but certainly some types of extractive activities are likely not going to be included, and so we may see some of the same sorts of effects inside the wind energy areas that we see inside MPAs. So there are. We've learned a lot of lessons learned from this, and again, I think that the key take homes really are that that this system off the West Coast is really variable, and it's likely going to be difficult to detect many of these changes due to the inherent variability and climate change. And while there certainly are things that we aren't monitoring really well, the California Current Large Marine Ecosystem is incredibly well monitored. There is an enormous amount of information in some cases that has been collected over many, many decades. And we think that one of the major sort of next step priorities is trying to pool all of these existing data sets on abundance and distribution, plus the oceanographic processes that derive many of those things, and try to gain a better understanding of, mechanistic understanding of how these processes are operating. Pulling all of these data together, that's really going to help us identify where the true gaps in our knowledge are going to be. Where are the high priority things that we don't have really good information on, and that's where we think that new in water monitoring is going to be important. Obviously, some other really important steps. Engagement is going to be critical. As Rikki mentioned, that engagement with tribal groups was not effectively achieved. We know that there's going to be need to be some incorporation of traditional ecological knowledge, as well as local and frontline communities that are likely going to be affected by changes in development from offshore wind, as well as fishing communities, aquaculture, and then other important users of ocean space. As we mentioned, we did not really include specific places, and so we know that there are going to be focused processes to evaluate those places. Humboldt clearly is going to be an important one if an integration staging and integration facility is built in Humboldt Bay. There certainly are going to be effects from that, so understanding what those are going to be is important. Other places like Morro Bay have been identified as possible locations for operation and maintenance facilities, and so understanding the the areas around Morro Bay or San Luis Obispo County more broadly is going to be also really important. So I want to acknowledge a huge number of people that participated in this. First, the California Ocean Protection Council, Department of Fish and Wildlife, and the POWC provided funding to support all of this. Our working group chairs helped helped as the cat herders for all of the many working group meetings. We could not have done this without them. A number of other key contributors who lent their expertise across the board. Our California agency collaborators were really important. Again, the 200 plus participants, and we also need to thank Zoom and Teams and Google Meet, without whom we could not have done this. And I also want to give a shout out to Zoe, Ella, and Hadley, who worked tirelessly behind the scenes to keep all of this stuff moving. So the three of you want to maybe show your video and give everybody a wave, just an acknowledgement of all of the enormous amount of work that all of you did. And then, of course, to Rikki, our fearless leader on this thing, who somehow managed to make all this go through many trials and tribulations. So thanks to everyone, and I think we've got some time for questions.
Thank you, Ben and Rikki, for that presentation. We are going to be continuing to take questions in the Q&A. I see some are going in the chat. It'll be helpful if we have them in the Q&A document. So if you're able to use that tool, we would appreciate it. As some further questions come in, there was one early on, just a clarifying question from one of the early slides, whether there would be an energy box or a substation associated with each turbine, or would multiple turbines be attached to a single one. And so Rikki or Ben, if you'd like to share a little bit more about what, if anything, we know about potential wind farm layouts.
Yeah, my understanding is that it's likely going to be multiple turbines feeding into a single substation, but my understanding is also that has not yet been finalized at all. I think there's an enormous amount about the specifics of the design and the layout that are still very much to be determined.
Thank you, Ben. A participant thanked both Rikki and Ben. Rikki, you mentioned it earlier, and Ben later, about the importance of Humboldt Bay. And it's great to hear there'll be a separate process. Do we have an estimate yet of the timeline from the state, how that might work, to have more specific monitoring guidance for specific places?
We do not have an understanding of what the timeline for next steps are. I think that, this document lays out a suite of kind of priorities, and obviously looking at particular places and spaces is, going to be a part of this, but I don't think that we are there yet. So as much as we know at this point.
Thanks, Rikki. In terms of the overarching process of the effects that were considered, can you talk about how, or if any, information from East Coast construction and operation plans and all of the environmental studies that have been done on the East Coast with non-floating wind might have been incorporated into this framework?
Absolutely. So at the beginning of this process, we really spent a lot of time, with invitations out to experts, with talking to people at the RWSC. We've kept in contact with them. We actually presented at their meeting about a month ago. We have shared earlier drafts. One of our early team members actually went from our team to the RWSC. And, as part of the literature synthesis that we did at the beginning, we really looked at a lot of the information that was in the white and gray literature from other locations, even looking at the North Sea and Asia, where a lot of this work is done, to try to understand what we could utilize for our West Coast environment. What we found, like we say, is that we have such a biodiverse system with so many migrating taxa, both birds and marine mammals and fishes that are moving through this area, that they're really, and the distinction that Ben made about the difference between the lack of pile driving in our ecosystem plans compared to what has been done in other locations. But certainly a lot of that earlier work was, examined in great detail and incorporated where we could. And that said, our scientists really felt like that's why, if you recall that scientific approach, that slide that I put up at the beginning, is we really went back to the drawing board. We looked at, we heavily relied on the RWSC's approach and their structure and their information gathering processes and applied those directly where they were applicable. And then we quickly realized that a lot of this we really needed to have to rely on expert opinion because the data just weren't there for our system. And Ben, feel free to jump in if I'm missing anything.
I think you did a great job of covering it, Rikki.
All right. Riffing on that a little bit, thinking about noise. So we won't have pile driving with floating offshore wind, but how much is known about the noise from the turning rotors themselves, and how that's transmitted in air, and whether or not those sounds are transmitted down into the water column?
I can take a shot at that. I don't know that what we talked about in terms of noise had a lot more to do with vessel traffic and spatial avoidance in terms of whether or not there will be noise that might influence birds and things like that. I think we talked much more about kind of the physical attraction to the structures themselves, the aggregation of potential insects and things like that, and then the attraction to lights. So because these are so far offshore and they extend so high up in the air, the propensity for in interaction with airlines and things like that, these things will be lit up. And so that light may attract things like bats, particularly, and the aggregation of, potential prey items. I think once we know the specific design envelope, specifications for our turbines, and there's great work being done by Harvey, JT Harvey and Integral, looking at kind of the 3D movement of these birds and bats. And I think that this, kind of pause in forward momentum in California gives us an opportunity to drill down on some of these specific questions that we've honed in on. And in terms of noise impacts below the water, I think a lot of the concern is like the electromagnetic fields that might be placed out there, whether or not those are giving any energetic discharges that might, either attract or detract larvae, pelagic larvae, or juveniles or things like that. But kind of sound from the actual rotation of the turbines was not, discussed at length. However, once we know that information, we were working off of very general design specifications for the infrastructure, because I think it's important to realize that for a lot of these, the wind energy developers don't even know what the design specifications for some of this infrastructure will be.
Yeah, and just to add to that, the overwhelming vast majority of the work that has looked at acoustic impacts have looked at the effects of pile driving. It is a known substantial effect, and there's been lots of work on both those effects and ways to potentially mitigate that. There's been, from my understanding, much less about the sound generated by the turbines themselves. But I'll say, we expect there to be some sound, but it's likely going to be certainly at a much lower intensity than we see from pile driving, and I think therefore much less likely to result in some sort of population level impact for the organisms that we care about.
All right. We've had another participant drop a link in the chat about an article entitled
Yeah, we'll look at that for
Infrasonic
sure.
Acoustic Energy.
Great.
So maybe you can take that back to the working group and, and have them chew on that new article a little bit, included in the next draft. Um, and coming back to the pile driving, so there won't be pile driving because these are floating offshore wind platforms, but a participant has asked a question about pile driving in the bay, if there will be port improvements. And so was that considered by the working groups? Or is that a later
Yeah,
process when we
again,
get site specific?
I mean, we really pushed to incorporate Humboldt Bay specifically. Like I say, our charge was not to drill down on places, but we had such a challenge doing that without considering the unique and sensitive ecosystem of Humboldt Bay. So I think that, we're not aware of, what the next steps when these site specific monitoring plans will be developed, but I would certainly think that that will be incorporated, and then a lot of information will be provided, to incorporated to develop that, and certainly pile driving within Humboldt Bay, that will be what they use, and that will have impacts, particularly of concern. What we talked about with Humboldt Bay was, the dredging and filling associated with disturbance, with port infrastructure development, with deepening the channel. That's going to change the chemistry, sedimentation of Humboldt Bay. There was a lot of concerns about the haul out and pumping, and implications on kind of the energetics associated with disturbance of increased vessel traffic and any of the development that might occur in there with things like harbor seals and sea lions, as well as concerns to the nearshore vegetation for shorebirds, was discussed at length. So again, we did this on our own, and I would, we will certainly, if we have an opportunity, strongly urge, and I'm sure whoever does the follow-on work, that a lot of these insights that we gained from this incredible, wealth of information from these scientists who now all work really well together, which is great, will, want to drill into and focus on that. There was some discussion. Morro Bay is not going to be a port development area, but there were also similar concerns down in Avila, Port St. Louis area with, implications for sea otters and things like that. So there was a lot discussed in this, and, we just did our best to narrow the, dialogue and kind of output end of this to what we were charged with, but that doesn't mean that there's not a ton of knowledge that we glean from this that hopefully will be applied in future efforts.
And I guess I'll just add that we do think for Humboldt specifically, that really a Humboldt specific process that synthesizes, what is known and what the potential effects are going to be is going to be really, really important.
Thank you both. All right, I'm going to move us away from noise to some bigger picture questions.
Sure.
And we have two questions that are related to this thinking about offshore wind as a decarbonization strategy, and comparing the potential effects of wind development with the effects of climate change and not decarbonizing. And so I think one question is, did the team actually from a scientific perspective work out what are the potential effects of not decarbonizing versus what are the potential effects of decarbonizing but adding wind? So were those quantified as part of the process, or is this just yeah, Rikki's vigorously nodding.
Well, Ben, do you want to take a shot? I mean, we discussed at length. Yeah. Go ahead, Ben, and then
we certainly talked about it, but I think trying to quantify, how many tons of CO2 would be not produced by, would have been produced that weren't going to be if offshore wind is going to be developed and what was the sort of the climate impact of that? No, we didn't get into that, right? That's an incredibly complex modeling question, with too many unknowns for us to tackle. I think our approach was really more that, climate change is here. Excuse me, I will say global warming is here and oceans are warming and they are changing and we are seeing impacts, direct and quantifiable impacts to species and ecosystems throughout this area. And so, we know that we collectively have to decarbonize our economy, and this seems like one of the stages to get there. And certainly, we applaud the California state's goal to be completely carbon neutral by 2045. We think that is really, really important, and again, hopefully set a really good model for lots of other people if we can get there. We know that there have been impacts to things like common murres. Half the population of common murres, 2 million birds died or disappeared during the last marine heat wave up in Alaska, and they have not recovered. We know there was a unusual mortality event for gray whales on the West Coast that resulted primarily in climate-related impacts to changes in their food webs and food availabilities, that animals were effectively starving. So we know these effects are happening, and we know that they are potentially, not potentially, they are severe, and they have had direct and substantial impacts on populations.
So that is the setting in which this process is happening. Is it appropriate to have that as part of what comes out of the framework, or was the framework just developed to consider what are the potential effects of wind and what should be prioritized if wind goes forward?
That was more the direction that we came from. That said, there was broad scale agreement, I would say, within the experts that climate change is such an system-wide potential catastrophic impact that pursuing renewable energy is absolutely the way to go. And many individuals, felt that the potential effects of floating offshore wind pale in comparison to what climate change impacts will be. But there was also, a lot of dialogue about if we are only, raising the bar. I mean, now we see, AI centers, data centers came into being as we were doing this project over the last 2 years. And, if we are only raising the energy demand and raising the energy production and raising energy demand, then we're not reducing climate change impacts. But our tack on this was, neither pro or con offshore wind, but if offshore wind is coming to California, this is what you need to do to be able to detect whether or not there are environmental consequences of offshore wind. And I certainly think, maybe for Palsy or the Schatz group, I mean, looking at that trade-off is phenomenal, although, we're all in a really challenging position, right? Because we don't control energy consumption, except at an individual level.
All right, I'll move us away from the climate change decarbonization debate, but maybe we'll come back to it if we have more time at the end, because there's plenty more to discuss there. Some more specific questions. Do you see clear pathways for translating the important findings into implemented solutions? For example, like how predictive modeling could inform mitigation measures, design, siting curtailments, or monitoring instrumentation. Is there a clear policy pathway in place right now, or what are the levers the state has in working with developers in the future?
That's a great question. I think again, I do not, to be clear, and Rikki was very clear at the beginning, this is not a policy document, right? This is advice from the scientific community and a framework developed by the scientific community on what our judgment of the science suggests that, what things might be important for us to consider and how we might go about doing them. We've had lots of conversations about, sort of the mitigation and what mitigation has historically looked like. And many of us, I think, feel that there probably is a new approach that's needed and some new policies that are needed. I think trying to answer that question on the spot on a webinar, without having real meaningful engagement from from folks from agencies and from folks who are making policy, I'm very hesitant to go down and start suggesting new policy solutions. I do think some new approaches are needed, and I mean, again, we're talking just for the monitoring piece. We're going to be talking about an enormous amount of monitoring that's going to need to happen, and it is, as far as I know, not at all clear who is going to pay for it and who's going to own the data, right? And so many of the things that we're talking about here are just suggestions about the monitoring itself. I'm very hesitant to start making broad policy recommendations here, but I will say I would love to be involved in that conversation as it goes forward, and I think a lot of the folks that were part of this would as well.
Yeah, there was a lot of good ideas that came out of this, but again, that was out of our scope. And I think you saw that in some of those overarching recommendations that I was referring to, like defining the thresholds, the triggers, the mitigation. We were not supposed to consider adaptive management or mitigation, and yet a lot of those conversations occur, right? Because these are scientists who are working in this space. We, reviewed all that material and got up to speed on that, and were, incorporating it where we could. And so I think one of the a lot of lessons have been learned there's a global learning center that I participate in. There's the RWSC, and I think there's a lot of lessons learned there where collaboration with industry, especially right now, that equipment is not out there in the water. There's great work being done by Synchro and other groups that are looking at, can we affix sensors to their floating offshore wind infrastructure? So I think that we could easily pull together a lessons learned, from the conversations that were had within this group of amazing individuals. But yeah, we don't have it off the top of our head. And nobody's asking us for it.
All right. Well, there are a lot of other questions in that vein. For example, can we require the data to be publicly accessible? If you want to have the platforms bristling with instruments, as Ben mentioned, how do we require or request that the developers do that? So again, a lot of future work for California and engaging with the developers.
There's definitely a lot of opportunity for that, a lot of lessons learned. I know the Monterey Bay Aquarium team, is steeped in the policy. They've, played a huge role in that. And I'm sure there's great recommendations in terms of that. But certainly the expert scientists in this working group, are participants in a lot of those kind of working groups. And hopefully that will be a follow-on recommendation so that we can utilize this time well and get as many sort of regulatory policies that are in there that just make data collection and sharing of information much better for all of us.
Yeah. We would all, I think many of us would love to be involved in processes and love to have conversations with folks at agencies and with legislators about how we can ensure that all of these recommendations that the scientific community is very firmly behind are implemented. We know that's not straightforward and not simple.
Yeah.
All right. See if I can throw you a slightly simpler one. If we wanted to consider baseline monitoring. So I heard that the first recommendation is that we continue with all of the really good science that is being conducted in California, take an inventory of where gaps might be. But then we do have specific sites. And so if one wanted to consider what should happen before construction, would you do baseline monitoring at the project sites, at reference sites? How long would it be conducted for?
Yeah, I mean that's sort of like the $64 million question in all of this, right? It's actually going to probably cost more than $64 million.
Yeah.
The simple answer is D, all of the above, right? We want to do the data synthesis. We want to be collecting enormous amounts of data inside. We want to be collecting enormous amounts of data outside. But knowing that we are going to have limited resources, we're going to have to prioritize. We're going to have to make some very hard decisions about what stuff to do first. And as both of us mentioned, we really feel strongly in this, and the scientific community that was engaged in this feels really strongly that the first step is to focus on synthesizing, aggregating, analyzing, and developing models with the data that we have in hand. Like we said, this is an enormously or extremely well monitored ecosystem, and so we really feel that the first steps about data integration and data synthesis, and then some modeling to try to understand where are the gaps, what are the things what are the things that we don't know well that we know we need to know, and where are the places where we need to know more things that we don't know. And I think trying to sort of decide that today would be really hard, and I would be willing to bet that if we just said, okay, let's go forward and start doing some stuff now, that we're going to wind up having gotten it wrong.
Yep.
And had prioritized things that were in the wrong place. And essentially what that means is that we're using limited resources inefficiently. And so that's sort of, I think, where both of us stand, is that focusing on those steps first to make sure that we are using limited resources the most efficient way possible to collect the most valuable data that we possibly can.
And this group is like the expert working group chairs are, kind of discussing now who should be involved in that. I think we all agree that it needs to be a very collaborative, open process where we bring together the key scientists in this space who are conducting that monitoring to understand, like when we say data synthesis, that can mean anything from here to there, right? Like it's a huge ask. Like, what are the priority data that we think we're synthesizing? Who are those people? What are the things that are, interim output products that would really inform? We know about gaps in the WIAs for monitoring. So we know particularly for the Humboldt area that core monitoring programs do not occur there right now. And we want to look at kind of short-term and long-term fixes for these gaps, which might include something in the interim. We're already kind of on this, steel will not be in the water for at least 10 years, let's say, but given the natural variability in the system, we need that 10 years to be collecting that information to make predictions. That's what we really need this data synthesis for, to make predictions based on, under these conditions, in the future, this is where we anticipate organisms to be and occurring. And so I think that the good news is, well, there's several good news for California. You can tell English is not my first language in this. You can, that one, we have phenomenal monitoring. Two, we have a very collaborative work together kind of, attitude in California where people want to come together. Three, I think we have some of the most innovative, and technological advances. And so I think bringing all these, programs together and starting those conversations about what do we need to do to identify the critical, when you talk strategic, it's the, critical few, not the everything. And are there some short-term, low-tech fills that we can fill in some of those gaps now? And I'm thinking about, some stuff that Eric Bjorkstead was talking about at the Cal Coffee monitoring, like that would not, like how long, I don't know how long it would take to officially get Cal Coffee to extend several tracks in the Humboldt area, but maybe there's something that we could do in the short term that collects that similar kind of information. So certainly we're very interested in that, but I think it's going to take us all sitting down together, and using this document outlines the taxa, it outlines the questions, and then we can use this framework to then say, okay, if we really want to be able to answer that question and understand where the gaps are, this is what we need to analyze, and this is what the output would be.
Yeah, and just to add one more small point to that, I do think, given the policy coming out of the federal government at the moment, and some of the recent announcements about wind developers down in the Morro Bay wind energy area, I think it's really important for us to also consider the possibility that wind might not happen. I think we have to recognize that this is a real possibility that this might not happen. And so, is there a way for us to approach all of this, knowing that we are, thinking about all of this in support of offshore wind, to make sure that we can understand what the potential impacts are, and also make sure that the work we're doing can be used for, broadly understanding our oceans, or broadly understanding this incredibly important ecosystem, and how other users of ocean space might be, might impact or be impacted by these changes. I think it's really important. And again, that is a huge ask, and we recognize that. But I think it's really important to keep that in mind as we move forward.
Thank you. We've had a participant ask, how do you envision the integration of tribal and indigenous knowledge as this process moves forward, since you expressed it wasn't done to the extent that you had hoped from the beginning? How has tribal or indigenous knowledge been analyzed or in the context of other groups or other infrastructure projects on the West Coast or elsewhere?
I don't know the answer to that question. We did send out a call for tribal scientists and tribal experts to be part of these working groups. It was not successful. We had a lot of shift in membership of the working group members, that we constantly had to try to get new expertise due to DOGE and the federal cuts and things like that. I do know that there will be a substantial formal tribal consultation period over the next 2.5 months that's being led by the Ocean Protection Council to provide input into this. And we certainly made recommendations about tribal input in the future, much of which was to formally include tribal representatives and tribal scientists into any future effort. So we would hope that would, not only tribal scientists, but also I think that we realized through this process that there is a large misunderstanding of offshore wind, and there's a lot of really good reason for it. But offshore wind in California is new. Everybody's confused. There has not been huge outreach and education and communications about what are we talking about and what aren't we talking about. And so I think that led to a lot of the initial knee-jerk kind of concerns and lack of participation, because there is just not a good understanding of what is happening or may happen in California, and that landscape is only, increasingly confusing in the state right now, with, a lot of the leases being pulled. And so I think that as we learn more and more what is going to happen in California, I would hope that there are, much more robust efforts to have stakeholder, contributor working groups contributing to and sharing their concerns and issues and ideas, as well as a really formal, tribal input working group as well. So just because it wasn't super successful with our effort does not mean that it can't be in the future.
Thank you. I have participant asked about the potential for an early scale demonstration project, and to what extent might such a project contribute to scientific understanding and environmental data needed for future projects?
Yeah, there's been lots of conversation about this. There is one project that has been proposed off of Point Conception by Vandenberg, the California Demonstration Project. That project is fundamentally really different from everything else that is proposed in California. It's inshore near a very sensitive area in state waters, as opposed to this area very far offshore. Based on our conversations with the developers, no one has really expressed a ton of interest in financing and funding a demonstration project, simply because the costs to do everything are so high. And again, this is based on our understanding of conversations with folks who would be doing this and enacting this. But I think that's very, very unlikely to happen on the West Coast.
Yeah, and a lot of the concerns that we've heard about Kadimo have to do with that project is so near shore that it doesn't really replicate the conditions in which it's going to be, modeling. Again, these areas are 25, 30 miles offshore, 28, 30 miles offshore, and the taxa and the ecological processes are fundamentally different out there. So yeah, I don't know and that's a huge investment of time and money that I think our scientists really feel fundamentally that data synthesis, data integration, and sharing and identifying these gaps and getting out there and understanding our incredible system, whether it's for offshore wind or it's for future climate change. I think that this has brought together this really cross-cutting, working group that looks at all taxa and all habitats in a very unique way that I haven't seen done in California before for this far offshore. And so I don't get the sense that anybody thought that was a great idea.
All right. We did have one participant comment that even though a deep dive into Humboldt Bay may need more effort in the future, groups did assess the estuary and nearshore impacts in the document, and they suggest that there is quite a bit of information available in the final report for reference. So for anyone who is curious about that, apparently there's more information in the report than we've had time to present today. Another attendee commented that they think it's important to include the diversity of all the infrastructure proposals in the larger effort. So thinking about the offshore wind plus the heavy lift terminal and the transmission that's different in Humboldt Bay and further along. And so I think at some point you mentioned there isn't a time frame for specifically addressing the impacts of increased vessel traffic. They're wondering if there are a number of diverse ways this process could move forward, and if you all know what are some of the potential next steps.
When you mean this process, you mean sort of the construction, and is that what you mean, like the details? I guess I don't fully understand the question.
Yeah, I'm thinking maybe
this
considering all of the elements together and how the different timelines of them might drive the prioritization of questions and monitoring.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll say that whatever we thought when we started this project, whatever we thought the timeline was for the sort of ongoing development of offshore wind, I think it's safe to say that that timeline has changed. And I am definitely not gonna even remotely make a guess as to what that timeline would look like. And so, we know that there are processes that are going to need to happen, you know, that would need to happen in Humboldt and in Long Beach in order to support, the staging and integration, right? The construction of these things. There will need to be some sort of a operations and maintenance facility, for at least the Morro Bay wind energy area. There are several places, some nearby, some throughout the state that could potentially serve that need. And again, all of those are very much still to be determined. And so again, I think if I understand the question, I honestly don't think that we can answer anything about the timeline because there is so much uncertainty. And again, as we mentioned, that a couple of years ago, I think we were all fairly certain that this was going forward, and now I am much less certain of that. And so trying to predict that timeline is going to be really, really difficult.
Yeah, and I'll just say, in case Ben is not interpreting the question right, because I'm not clear of it either, this project is done in 7 days. Like, this team of scientists is not an ongoing sort of thing. So this project is to deliver the framework, and that framework is being handed to the Ocean Protection Council, and then it is in the Ocean Protection Council's hands for next steps. We are not clear on, what the involvement or engagement of this scientific team of experts. We would certainly love to be, because it's been, thrilling to work with all of these groups. We work well together, and we have a lot of follow-on recommendations. But maybe part of our hesitancy in saying those is nobody's asking us to do that.
All right, we're going to ask a more specific question about this exact document that is being delivered to OPC. Is this a final, or is there going to be a public comment period that maybe OPC is going to handle? Yeah. What are the next steps for this document?
This document is considered a draft document, and at which time it is in the hands of the Ocean Protection Council, and the Ocean Protection Council is going through a 2-month formal tribal consultation period, at which time my assumption is that OPC would be making any modifications or changes to that document, and a final will be delivered at the end of August 2026.
Okay, thank you. All right. So we can go. We've got time. I'm not sure. May I keep us on track? Do we have time for a few more questions?
Yep, I think we've got about 10 more minutes.
10 more minutes for questions. Okay. So let's go back to this, thinking about what we can learn from constructions and operations plans. And so not suggesting that data collected those projects are directly transferable to the West Coast, but will some of the processes and information required by the regulations be the same as what California needs in this framework? So maybe not necessarily the actual data, but the processes and the kinds of monitoring.
That's a great question, and that feels more like a policy question to me than a science question. And so again, I defer partly to the state and partly to the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management to answer those. So I will formally punt.
Yeah. Agreed. I think our scientists have a lot of thoughts on those and would love for a lot of this information to be required information to collect. And I think that just figuring out the policy arms to, make that happen. And now we have time to maybe make that happen. So,
okay. So not thinking, all right, we'll say not thinking about what's happening on the East Coast, but if we're going to take the first step of taking advantage of all the existing data that's being collected in California, um, can you clarify any gaps that have been identified in what scientists think we need before we let wind projects move forward? So were there any things that were identified as like, before we make a decision, before projects proceed, this is the kind of information we're not yet gathering and we need to gather as a state before we move into like constructions and operations plans and monitoring that developers would carry out?
Yeah, again, I hate to punt again. That feels like a complicated question, right?
It's very complicated.
And part of it is, what is the level of detail? What is the level of effect that we want to try to detect, right? And some of that is our ability to detect that is partly going to, well, not partly, in large part going to depend on how variable the system is itself. And so, I hate this analogy, but I'm going to use it anyway. It's sort of like asking how long is a piece of string, right? We have some sense of the variability of some components of this system, but I don't think we've got really much of a sense of how strong of an effect, a variety of different aspects of wind farm construction is going to have, at least offshore. And so some of that really comes down to, how big of an effect are we interested in detecting? And then how much additional data, resolution do we need to be able to detect those effects? I think that's assuming that I'm understanding the question. I think that's where I sit, but go ahead, Rikki.
Yeah, I would say that one thing we know we don't know is this integration of oceanographic and environmental information with distribution of key species. And so in each working group, we identified key species. And one of the foundational gaps we found is that we need basic distribution data for some of these taxa that we don't know where they are or why they are where they are, and they are likely going to be impacted by offshore wind. So beaked whales, dynamic soaring birds, potentially bats, although there was a lot of debate about bats. So it's been done, for a few species, but it hasn't been done holistically. I think another area that people are concerned of that we don't have data for is upwelling. There's been great modeling that's been done by Kaus Raghukumar, looking at the overall changes to upwelling in terms of intensity and scale will not change, but there is, locational, like where it happens, may change. And is that, I think that understanding the overarching upwelling impacts, and that's expensive data collection, is one thing. Looking at the fundamental distribution of some of these key taxa that are identified, and how they might respond, to potential effects that we know of. Things like alien species spread with the platforms. We know we're going to be putting platforms out there. We're going to be having a lot of ships going back and forth, and we are likely going to have invasive species. That's a hard thing to do. So I think the scientists, to be able to monitor, to be able to mitigate, maybe that's not a place that we put resources, but looking more into like these entanglement questions with secondary and tertiary entanglement, vessel strikes, because we see how many vessels are dying off of California with vessels. So I think there's a finite subset of things that this expert, the bat people are going to argue for the bats, and the, bird people are going to argue for the birds, and the larvae and coccolithophore people are going to argue for that. But I think that there is a manageable set of things that these scientists would agree, this is where we need to fill in. And then, the question of we don't even know what's out there for a lot of the species in these new wind energy areas. So just foundational expansion of cow coffee, the NOAA rockfish cruises, the access and MODIS, bird and bat monitoring systems are great places to start.
All right, I've got two really good wrap-up questions for you. So maybe just some quick answers from each of you for this. So first, in this deeply collaborative, far-reaching analysis, what is one thing each of you encountered or learned that you didn't expect?
Lions, tigers, bats, bears.
I guess I'm gonna go in a different direction, and I'm gonna say maybe I should have expected this, but like when you have an amazing team that you're working with on a regular basis and you're talking to them all the time, it actually makes the process really, really fun. And so I guess that's just my way of thanking, Rikki and the Cal Poly team and the CMSF team, because you all have been absolutely phenomenal. And the chairs and all the other close collaborators, right? Everybody has been so phenomenal to work with. And it really has made this really challenging work so much fun to engage in. So thanks, everybody. And thanks for that softball. Thanks for that softball, Sarah.
Rikki, do you have an unexpected?
Yeah, I mean, I guess one of the things that was unexpected, I'll ditto and perfect answer, Ben. Thanks for taking that one. But I think one of the things that I really learned was, as scientists, we are objective. We don't go in with a pro or a con offshore wind. That said, we all have our personal, I'm not so sure this is a great idea. And, living in Denmark and Scandinavia and seeing all the wind infrastructure, I must say I was at first much more concerned about what type of impacts our scientific experts were going to be concerned about. And I was surprised at how specific, sort of taxa or process specific and manageable if we hold the developers and the industry and the regulators to, hold their fire to the feet or feet to the fire, that we can make this be positive for the environment at the same time. So that was a surprising finding for me, that I am less concerned about the environmental impacts, except for the decommissioning part. There's never been a decommissioned offshore wind farm. So that gives me pause still.
All right, I've got another reflection question. So after working with this great group of scientists for so long, and we don't know what the future of offshore wind looks like for California. But you, as involved in the Marine Sanctuary Foundation, or Ben, as the director for Coastal Marine Sciences, what are you excited to work on next? Like after working with all these great scientists, are there new questions for your respective organizations that you're like, yes?
We'd love to do the next phase, work with this team and bring people together and, drill down on this. And I think, what I think is that there's a lot of things we could do at the outset that I would love to work to the developers we know now what the key things we're worried about. And if moving the rotor swept zone up 3 meters, makes a difference, I think designing the equipment to reduce the potential effects is a huge one. Filling the gaps in monitoring and getting these teams of people to actually collaborate and work together would be great. So I don't want to say goodbye to Ben forever.
Yeah, Rikki, you're stuck with me. Yeah. So I guess I echo that. I certainly like to be involved in the next steps of this. We've all been thinking about these things for a really long time, and this group collectively, I think, has an enormous amount that we can offer in terms of the knowledge and the perspectives from our years of working in this field and from our years of working on this specific challenge. I guess for me, the thing that most excites me, I'm going to try to look at a silver lining about the pause, is the opportunity to integrate this in a way that includes not just offshore wind, but thinking about, all sorts of renewable technologies, wave energy, aquaculture in these spaces, there are ways for us to change marine transportation, all sorts of these things that, understanding, the dynamics and setup and the way that these systems function and how they might respond to new changes in the ocean of things that I think in many cases things that we have to do in order to try to deal with the climate crisis. So I guess for me that's the place I'm most excited about, and I want to say also a huge thank you to all of our the funders and the collaborators and the state agencies who are really dedicated to all of these things, um, and I'm looking forward to continuing to work with folks in these questions, hopefully for the rest of my career. So there's that.
All right. Well, thank you, Ben and Rikki, for your time today, and for everyone who joined us, all the participants, all the people who submitted really great questions to make Ben and Rikki think really hard, and make the state think about what some next steps maybe should be. Some good suggestions for next steps of the process. As mentioned in our introductory comments, this webinar will be posted on the Shots Energy Center website, and the PAUSI.us and our YouTube channel. Maya has just dropped into the chat contact information for Dr. Eriksen and Dr. Ruttenberg, as well as the CMSF offshore wind page and this draft framework document. So all of the resources are there now in the chat after the questions. If you have questions about PAUSI research, the Pacific Offshore Wind Consortium, for which Ben and I are on the leadership team, or you're interested in receiving updates about reports and events of some of the projects that I mentioned at the beginning, you can email info@pausi.us and get on our mailing list. And I don't think that one's in the chat, but maybe Maya, you can drop that in. Great. And she's got also a link to the Shots Energy Center. So thank you again, all the participants and the presenters, for spending time with us this afternoon, and hope to keep the team alive.
Thank you so much. And we are always available. And if anybody emails us, we're happy to dive in. So.
Yeah, thanks to the PAUSI, thanks to Rikki and the team, and thank you, Sarah, for being such a fantastic facilitator. This was
definitely great. And thanks, Maya and Arnie, and the whole PAUSI team. Thank you so much. So, alrighty.
Till next time.